to our 45th web debate, the first web debate this year. So it is my special pleasure to welcome you all back. As you know, we meet once a month to discuss key issues and new topics in diplomatic practice. We organize these debates in the context of the International Forum on Diplomatic Training. And it is my pleasure to moderate this debate, which I think is a really timely topic as we discuss visual storytelling for diplomatic practice. So with this topic in mind, allow me to very quickly set the scene. So 2020, last year, was really the year that diplomacy went virtual. And I think there is no better example than the opening of the General Assembly last year in September, where heads of state and heads of government delivered their speeches virtually through pre-recorded video messages. And I think this is really indicative of the fact that the visual image is gaining quite some importance in diplomatic practice. So with this debate, basically, we want to ask, what can we learn from this? What are best practices? And what are some of the things best avoided? So in a sense, we will look back at 2020 and analyze what's been happening in order to then project the lessons learned onto this year and what lies ahead. In order to do so, we have two excellent speakers, and it's my pleasure that they both agreed to join us today and took the time out of their schedules. Let me briefly introduce them. We have with us Ms Stéphanie Fillion. She is a Canadian journalist specializing in international affairs. She's based at the United Nations headquarters in New York City, and she's a regular contributor to Past Blue, an independent media covering the United Nations. She's also, among many other things, the co-host of the podcast UN Scripted. Welcome, Stephanie. It's a pleasure to have you. We also have with us Dr Massimiliano Fusari. He's an academic and consultant on visual storytelling with a focus on social topics and international affairs. He is an associate professor at the University of Westminster in the UK, and he runs his online lab, the Visual Storytelling Academy. Before we enter into a dialogue with our speakers, let me also remind you, our audience, that we try to make this debate as interactive as possible. This means we're looking forward to your questions and your comments. You can post them either here in Zoom in the chat box, or you can post them on YouTube and Facebook in the respective chat boxes if you're joining us there. Together with my colleagues, and here in particular Adriana Gavrilovic, we will be looking at all these comments and questions and we'll be bringing them back into the debate. Let me also quickly use this opportunity to welcome a very special segment among our participants today, which are the students in our current online training course on online meetings and conferences. And we hope that this introduction to visual aspects of communication and digital diplomacy will be very helpful in their learning journey. So having said all of this, I think it's time to get into the debate. So without further ado, I would like to turn to you, Stephanie, as you're really situated in one of the global hubs when it comes to diplomatic practice. So it will be really interesting to hear your perspective and your observations. So we are now almost 1 year after the pandemic started. And what can you tell us? How has digital diplomacy changed? How has it evolved at the United Nations and at other international organizations?
Yes, thank you so much, Katharina, and thank you for inviting me and for organizing this event. I think, it's a great topic, and I'm excited to hear from my colleagues and to hear from people who are here with us to have a discussion. So, before turning to UNGA, I just sort of wanted to look back because it's almost been a year when, on March 1st, the first coronavirus case was diagnosed in New York City. And I remember on March 10th, I was writing an article about how the UN Security Council was testing a new video teleconferencing software to do their work remotely in case the United Nations headquarters had to close. And that happened only 5 days later on March 15, when most of the UN work had to be done at home. And what followed then was sort of a 2-week blackout when we didn't hear from the Security Council at all. They will only hold some, closed door meetings. So this was sort of a concerning pattern, considering that, the Security Council had to do so much during this pandemic. And on March 23rd, the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, asked the international community to adhere to a global ceasefire. So, after that, the Security Council opened up a bit. We've seen some state members such as Germany and Russia try to hold some in-person meetings at the UN, because diplomats really miss in-person meeting, I can tell. But it's been a challenge to do so, because every time, you see diplomats back in the chamber, there tend to be new outbreaks. So you tend to see diplomats going back to VTC quite often, even if now there's a good hybrid at the UN. So I would say that, 1 year in, we still see in the Security Council a lot of diplomats either talking where they're being muted, or talking over one colleague because they didn't realize they were not muted. We still see, live translation is still a challenge, and it is so important in the Security Council. I can only think some diplomats, sort of relied on translation in the past, and now they're just stuck to make their statements in English, which can be challenging. And we still see also some prime minister, presidents who are invited on the council being interrupted either by, technical problems and everything. So, while I feel like digital diplomacy has become the new normal, there are challenges, and some of them stem from the fact that I believe some diplomats just think that, still had in mind that it wasn't going to last. And, 1 year in, digital diplomacy still prevails. And I believe in a way that, there are some people that have accepted it and try to look at it differently, but at the same time, some people see it as temporary. So there is sort of a need for innovation. And before going to UNGA, I just wanted to share one trend that I've sort of noticed in the past maybe few weeks or months, that I've seen from a lot of prime ministers and presidents, because, telephones and, video conferences has become so important that, we've seen sort of pictures now that it's extremely hard to visually make a phone call interesting. So we've seen a lot of pictures online of just sort of a president or prime minister talking to a phone or talking to a screen. And I would love to hear from people, who maybe working with ambassadors, maybe working, with ministers or something like that, how they're really thinking about this. So here are some examples that we've seen, from France, from Canada, from the United States. I'm just going to, okay. And then that's one example I thought was interesting from South Africa's President Ramaphosa, who was talking to the Director General of WHO. So that's one different way of, showing how a phone call happens. And here's one example coming from Estonia that I thought was a little bit more dynamic in terms of at least, showing who you're talking to, are you talking to them? So this is, I believe, a trend that we're going to see more and more often, because that's how diplomacy is being done right now. But visually, I can tell that it is a challenge for press offices to really, show people how now it is being done. And something that really got me into thinking about this was really the 75th UN General Assembly, because it was such an important event for the United Nations. It was the 75th anniversary of the UN. And at the same time, it was such an unusual event that took place in New York. I mean, New Yorkers, I'm sure, were thrilled because their traffic didn't get disturbed as usual for 1 week. But other than that, for diplomats, it was extremely unusual because everything, pretty much everything happened online. The United Nations headquarters was almost empty. Only some diplomats were inside to introduce videos pre-recorded by heads of states, heads of governments, or foreign ministers. So one thing that became the most interesting part of the UN General Assembly was actually how people were thinking about these videos, because, you had 200 of them. So you really had to sort of make them differently to stand out, because those are, 5 minutes, 10 minutes videos that pretty much all look the same, which is a head of state, head of government just sitting at the desk and speaking. So one way to do that was, as you can tell, here are some examples that were not in my article about do's and don'ts of digital diplomacy. So here are some just very interesting backdrop that I thought were beautiful from later days. So we have here Myanmar, you know, with some flags, with some people in the background. And we also have a beautiful ocean view that I thought, you know, was interesting. Something else that we've seen in some countries, we've seen the Greek prime minister recording his video in front of, I believe, the Acropolis, and the Australian Prime Minister in front of the Opera in Sydney. So I think that's something that can be interesting visually to also show something that's very significant, something that, you know, people know about the country, especially during the UN General Assembly. Here are some more examples. So we have Nicaragua speaking in front of a world map. So that is also something that really stood out among different offices. And the one that I thought was the most beautiful one was definitely the president of North Macedonia, who has decided, you know, to speak in front of a very typical mosaic, typical Macedonian mosaic that is from the Macedonian presidential palace, and also in front of Macedonian flight. So that's something that really stood out as well. Now, something that was also very interesting was the Costa Rican president, who decided to speak the whole time with a mask on. So especially in the midst of this pandemic, that is something that definitely stood out, that he was sending a strong message about the pandemic. And we also saw President Maduro of Venezuela, who did the same thing, but he took out his mask very quickly. So, but the Costa Rican president decided to keep it on during the whole UNGA. So when you want to send a message like that, that's something that can be interesting. After that, so we were expecting some leaders to integrate some multimedia content to their video, because that's something you can easily do when you use pre-recorded videos. It ended up being Duterte from the Philippines who did that. Maybe that's not what we expected, but he did a pretty interesting use of multimedia. So while I was speaking, his team, I guess, added some videos, some images that would sort of illustrate the point he was making. And they did it pretty well. You know, you can, not all of the images fit perfectly with what he was saying, which is something extremely important. But I think overall, Duterte did a good use of multimedia in his video. So that's something to consider. That can definitely make your work more dynamic. Then something else I noticed is the Russian President Vladimir Putin. So something that is well known in sort of political circles is that Putin has, his height is something very interesting, because he is in general not as tall as other world leaders. He's believed to be between 5'10" and 5'7". So he is believed to wear lifts in his shoes, and that's an important component of his image. And I think that we can notice it in this screenshot here, which is, I believe his team did a very good job at making him look tall and making you look even, I would say, tall and powerful, because as you can notice, the podium is very low on the picture, and the microphone as well, which really makes him look sort of taller. And, you know, those are some very small details, just the way you place the camera, just the way you place the podium, but they can have a real impact on the way people look at the video and the way you're portrayed. Now maybe that's a part of a don't do of a digital diplomacy. This is, of course, from this President Paul Kagame. So his team, I guess, had the brilliant idea of using a teleprompter while he was recording his speech. The only problem is that they didn't place perfectly the teleprompter, and it made it very obvious that he was using a teleprompter. So we could see sort of his eyes read. And I think that just a very simple movement, just moving the teleprompter a bit, moving the camera just so it's centered, would have made a big difference, because using a teleprompter, I think, can be a brilliant idea for pre-recorded speeches, but it's something that you need also to do sort of skillfully. Now, another example that a diplomat pointed out actually on Twitter that I thought was something important to point out. So here we have the South Sudanese president who decided to show up to the General Assembly. And he does that pretty often with sort of a cowboy hat, but also with some pretty luxurious accessories. So just wanted to point out, especially considering that, South Sudan is ravaged by war and its GDP per capita is around $1,200 a year. So, showing off very luxurious item, maybe not the best thing to do in an international platforms like the United Nations when you talk about human rights and when you really sort of want to talk to, the general population. So showing off wealth may not be ideal. And we also have the Afghan president, Ashraf Ghani, who, I think a lot of people get sort of uncomfortable when you record these videos, you don't really know what to do with your hands. And I think in this case, he was just told, keep them on your desk. But what he did is he pretty much just put his hand and stick them on the desk. And it made from a sort of unnatural video. So that's something to think about, just to, record your video as if you were just talking very normally. And that can make something sort of more natural. So that's something. And finally, we have, again, the Estonian president who did a very fine video. It was well recorded and everything. The only thing we just wanted to mention, I guess, that Estonia is a leader in terms of digital diplomacy. So maybe we're expecting a little bit of fireworks coming from Estonia, maybe some innovation. And while her video was perfectly fine, we didn't see that. So we were a little bit disappointed. And now I know some of you may be in Switzerland, and this is not part of UNGA. This is something that we've seen later on. So some talking about innovation in digital diplomacy. So I think I've seen some Swiss diplomats who are attending right now. So one thing I thought was very interesting, some innovation. Switzerland launched its campaign for a seat on the Security Council in October or November, and they decided to invite diplomats to a virtual raclette. So they sent every participant a little oven, and they showed them how to do it. And I think it made up for a very entertaining event. And so those are ways of sort of thinking out of the box that I just wanted to finish with that, because I thought Switzerland did a very good job on this.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. I really enjoyed the presentation. There are already so many things you mentioned that I would love to follow up on. I will hold back for now because we want to hear from our second speaker, Massimiliano. But I think there are so many do's and don'ts you mentioned, so many little details that we can pick up on and look further into that are really useful and interesting for diplomatic practitioners. So with that in mind, I want to turn to you, Massimiliano. So we just debated the example of the opening of the UN General Assembly last year in quite some detail. And taking this as an example, I want to hear from you, because you're someone who studies visual aspects of diplomatic practice in quite some detail as an academic, but also as a consultant. And so with that example in mind, what are your general observations, Massimiliano? And are there any best practices you can distill from this example? I would love to hear more from you. So over to you, Massimiliano.
Thank you, Kat. Thank you, Stephanie. Can I just check that you're actually seeing my presentation? Wonderful. So thank you very much. Welcome to the second leg of this web debate on visual storytelling for diplomatic practice. I will build on Stephanie case studies. I have worked on a selection of them, and I will come back later at a later stage with on something very interesting that Katharina said about the visual image, which I think is just perfect. So today's agenda is, I will touch on 3 points, which is how do we produce visual content? How do we choose visual content? How we combine form and content as visual storytelling. And then I'll recap and share a few best practice. So let's get started with how do we produce visual content. And I want to touch, again, working on some of the examples that Stephanie has pointed out. I will refer to President Kaljulaid, I hope I pronounced it correctly, from Estonia, and President Putin from Russia. And I will use them as case studies, pointing out how composition and framing within the picture, the image, is actually a key driver to allow audiences to read and decode visual messages. So I will start with the president from Estonia, and I will refer to the golden ratio, which is something we have been using for thousands of years and is a way of breaking the space roughly, very roughly. If we break the space in three, it's 1/3, we put the main character. It's just one element that our brain immediately recognizes and use it to read the image and find a way to decode it. And this will take us to part 2 and part 3. Before moving on, I will refer to inverted triangle as a way of reading the framing with President Putin. So my way of reading this is actually putting a triangle pointing down to the podium. So we have the base of triangle putting right on top of President Putin's head, and then pointing to his hand. My apologies. And then we can connect the hand with the face by means of his tie. So actually this gives us a way of reading, and whether we are conscious, aware of that, this is how our brain reads this composition. So again, composition is a way for us, is a tool for us, like framing, to direct our audiences, and we'll come back on audience right now, to direct our audience in reading the image as we hope. Let me finish with another element which will come back throughout this presentation, which is the wings, which is a term borrowed from theater. The wings are actually the curtains on the two sides of the stage, and is a way to define and delimit the space on which the performance is going to happen. So in a way, we have the two wings in President Putin video, but it can also happen as a single wing, as for instance, in the case of President Halulide, which is just a way to counterbalance the preeminence of the golden ratio. So it's just a way to balance and to help us fill up the space, right? Just leaving our eyes roaming around with no idea. Point 2, how do we choose visual content? And I will follow up on Stephanie and the case of President Pendarovsky of North Macedonia, and compare to that of President Xi Jinping from China. I will build up on the mosaic. Clearly, the flags are there as a clear and strong testament and projection of who is talking. But the mosaic, in my view, is an element that fails, or actually doesn't convey enough information for any international audience. It's hard to read that visually, just to read it, but also it's hard to connect that to actually North Macedonia. It's a way, to me, is a lost opportunity for North Macedonia to actually project its identity on the global stage. By opposition, what we can see in China, we have the Great Wall, which is an iconic symbol that works both internally, immediately recognized, as well as internationally recognized anywhere in the world. So what should we put into the frame? What for? If the mosaic was a way to portray North Macedonia, I think it could have been chosen something different, the lakes, many other things. If not, we could actually argue whether this was something to communicate to President Pendarovsky constituency, internal audiences, and the people in North Macedonia. It's something that is actually talking to its own constituency. Either way, I think there should have been a better and more strategic option of what to communicate on the international stage, which leads us to the third point, how to combine form and content into visual storytelling. And I will work on another case that Stephanie pointed out, which is President Maduro. President Maduro of Venezuela? No. Of the Republic of Venezuela? No. Of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. And that is communicated very effectively and throughout his video by reference to the painting in the back. We have Simon Bolivar in the background, and again, building up on what I just said on audiences, it is, I would assume confidently that anyone in Venezuela would recognize him as Simon Bolivar. Pretty much anyone in South America would do the same. And even for international audiences who don't know Simon Bolivar, we have a projection of a leader, of a military leader, and someone from the past. And that is clear in the painting. It's a projection, it's a strong projection that works on multiple levels and on multiple directions with all audiences. This is effective visual storytelling and translate into the second step, which is, President Maduro as heir to Simon Bolivar, and starting to make his own statement wearing a mask. It's absolutely relevant, the fact that he took it off later. He started with that, and he's making a statement. And then he's building up that statement through reference to the flag of Venezuela, the flag of the UN. And again, we are working on a triangle at the base of which we have the hands of Maduro. And again, whenever we need to communicate a human being, we use the face and the hands as a privileged point of communication. And if we mirror that triangle, we have another triangle flipping on the base and actually moving on the two sides, the flag of Venezuela, the flag of the UN, pointing at the symbol of the presidency. Again, this is extremely effective, fluid visual storytelling, touching on multiple levels to overlapping and composite audiences, and testifying the relation between Simon Bolivar and President Maduro in terms of leadership, legitimacy, and institutional authority by means of visual communication. And this is continue on this vertical line over and over between Simon Bolivar, President Maduro, and the institution of the republic, of the presidency. Let's recap. Let's give our time to the debate. So, the nature of diplomacy remains communication. Diplomacy is communication. Diplomacy, to be effective, has long integrated form with content. And as per 2018, visual form accounts for more than 85% of all digital content. I'm trying to promote and define visual storytelling as that feature that combines effectively form with content to take us beyond the sum of the two. It's what I define in 1 and 1 giving 3. Visual storytelling is the ability to again communicate, like in the case of President Maduro, and that happens regardless that had been planned or had just happened. Visual storytelling is the ability to take our audiences beyond, to make them engage with what we are portraying or actually asking them to do. It's a powerful tool that we are just starting exploring. And I want to conclude with 2 best practices on how to craft visual storytelling as diplomatic practice. 1, make it purposeful. And I cannot think of any better example, sorry for moving away from UNGA, than President Biden first day in office. And we see on the left a huge pile of paper, of documents. We might know it's his executive orders, that is irrelevant. We see it's paper, and it's a huge pile on the left against a small pile on the right. And because we read from left to right, I speak Persian and Arabic, so I know other cultures do the other way around. But in this case, we are moving from left to right. And it's a pile and one. So it's a journey that has just started. It's not a journey that has yet to start with no document on the right, or lots of document on the right is a journey that is concluding. It's a journey that has just started. And that journey is a journey that has a pen to actually mark it as effective and as effective executive orders. And whether this was intentional or not, we have lots of pen in the foreground, again, to remind us that this is going to be a lengthy exercise of power, which is informed by a very clear statement. He's wearing a mask. And again, it just came out a report, a post-mortem about the Trump campaign, stating that he lost the election because of how he managed COVID. Concluding, so first point, make it purposeful. Second point is make it integrated, which translates into the fact of talking and communicating the same message across multiple platforms, channels, ways of communication, and strategically adapt the message upon the platform and the channel.
Believe me, many more people will see that selfie once I share it than will listen to this speech. And I hope that I took a good one.
Breaking the protocol by starting his speech with a selfie, very effective, and a way of engaging all audiences from his constituency back at home to the international audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Massimiliano. This was a brilliant overview. And again, just like I said with Stephanie, so many points we can pick up on, and so much good advice and details that we have to think about. My impression was that as diplomats, having to deal with this new technology, having to engage more with those visual aspects and videos, there's a lot to think about, from simple things as background to how you use your hand to even your jewelry. There are questions on lots of different levels, more technical questions, but also questions of symbolism, as both of your examples really illustrated. So there's a lot to digest and a lot to consider. Before I go to the question that I have in mind, I want to give precedent to the questions we have received in the chat. Let me also say, because of other commitments from our speakers, we only have about 15 more minutes in this discussion. So if you have comments and questions, now is the time to bring them. But I would like to hand over to my colleague, Andriana Gavrilovic, who has been keeping a keen eye on the comments and questions we received. And she'll give us a quick summary and highlight some of the questions that were most crucial or pressing. So over to you, Andriana. What did you find?
Thank you for the floor, Kath. It is my pleasure to be, let's say, the voice of the audience in Zoom. We have quite a few participants which are thanking our speakers for a very interesting set of presentations. And then there are a few questions. Now I'm struggling a bit to get them as they come in. So if I miss something, please do not take it the wrong way. I just didn't manage to see it in time. So the last question that came in is there something that we could call minimalism in visual storytelling? Another question was, what are lessons learned from the former President Donald Trump regarding visual storytelling? There was a question about new protocol rules. Should cameras be on during Zoom or online meetings? Is it fair and appropriate to have some interlocutors hidden? And there was another question regarding the overemphasized image of President Maduro. Are there any negatives to it? Is he compensating for his contested position? Is he protesting too much? I do believe that I picked up on everything, so I'll leave it to the speakers to try to choose the questions they found the most interesting. Back to you.
Thank you so much. I just saw one more question that just came in, which is from Jana Jodzinska. I would like the speakers to share with us some tips and tricks for the live events, meetings, etc. That is when there is no time to prepare the set. So we have, I took some notes, we have 5 questions so far. I would like to give this back to our speakers, but obviously Stephanie and Massimiliano, please feel free to pick and choose and comment as you see fit. But over to you, Stephanie, for some reactions and responses to the host of questions we received.
Yes, so, first of all, thank you, Massimiliano, for your presentation. And I think, I want to pick up on the question about Maduro, because, there's sort of the politics side of is visual storytelling. And I think that both of us sort of focus more on the visual side. And, there's no really, I don't really want to comment on Maduro's plays, but I think in general, looking at how his video was framed and what was in the video is really telling about his place in politics, especially considering, the fact that he had the UN flag in his video, for example. Not every head of state, head of government decided to have a UN flag in their video. And, this in a way sort of shows support to the UN, or at least sends a message that it's thinking about the UN. And I think that Maduro is extremely aware of image in the Venezuelan government as well. And if I can use an example that is not about visual diplomacy, but something that happened last year, and I think I should be able to show it to you, was when, President Trump was speaking last year and the Venezuelan diplomat decided to read a book while Donald Trump was speaking. So those are, I think Venezuelan diplomats are extremely aware of what they're doing, including Maduro. And I think his image during the General Assembly was very carefully crafted. And I'm very happy Massimiliano used this example, because having Simon Bolivar really sent a strong message to the international community. And, of course, every member state can sort of think what they want to think about Maduro, but in the end, he carefully crafted the message that he wanted to send.
Thank you. Over to you, Massimiliano.
I agree. I'm just trying to touch on the many points that were raised. Minimalism in visual storytelling. Actually, I do think that as a photographer, I do think that less is more always. So the less you actually communicate, the more you can manage the communication and the flow of the message. So I'm not suggesting that we should put in any way at any time use a lot. Actually, the challenge of communication is how to decide, how to understand what is the right balance, how we can communicate effectively. So again, I think there is no golden rule. Otherwise, yes, we will be out of work. But again, it's something that you build up on a day-by-day commitment in crafting your message and keeping on consistency. Whenever I both consult or teach, I always stress the relevance of consistency of the message and actually the ability to continue to portray that message over and over. I'm suggesting this as a technique in communication, regardless, as Stephanie was just mentioning, of the validity, of the truthfulness of the message. I'm talking about communication, and I'm not arguing anything in terms of politics. We can have a discussion about that in another context. The key point here is how to communicate, how to move beyond what we see, and hence, for instance, the example of the mosaic. How can we move beyond what we see and go beyond and actually craft a statement that works on multiple levels? I want to go back and very quickly go back to what Katharina said at the beginning about the visual image. It's something we tend to overlook, but actually the visual is not the image, and we have many images which are not visual. So again, that's part of confusion we have currently on visual storytelling. Visual storytelling is not only about what we see, it's also a lot about what we portray or we make feel. And again, that is part of the challenge of crafting a message and continuing crafting that message in a way that is consistent, effective, and actually reliable and perceived as real. So I think I've seen many other questions, so I'll leave it over to Katarina to actually redirect on this.
Yes, there's one set of questions I would actually like to pick up on again. Two questions in particular, which kind of focused on let's call it the everyday video conferencing. So you both analyzed so well these kind of high-level, highly crafted video messages that we saw at the UN General Assembly. Do you have any specific tips, tricks, hints for the kind of everyday video conferencing? There was one question on how to prepare. What to do if you're in a video conference. Do you have any tips, any lessons learned for that? And then the other question was on if we should always have our cameras on during video conferencing. Do you have any advice on that? Also with keeping in mind like diplomatic protocol, if it should be a protocol issue to discuss this or to have a very specific set of rules on this. Any comments from you will be very much welcome. So again, I would like to start with Stephanie and then over to Massimiliano.
So maybe taking a question on having cameras on. So what I've noticed at the UN is that very often there is a correlation between the age of the participant and whether they have their camera on or off. So to me, my experience, and I plead guilty with having my camera off from time to time, but the younger the person is and the more likely this person is going to have his camera off, the older the person gets, the more likely he's going to have the camera on. And I think it's pretty simple. There's a pretty simple explanation, which is I think, you know, there's a generation that grew up with cameras and people are used to sort of dealing with that. Well, I think there's a generation that's just so used to face-to-face interaction, and I believe that it's extremely important. And in diplomacy, you know, as I said, diplomats, I feel like they're really missing in-person's meeting, and they're missing the human interaction. And there is such a big value in in-person meetings that you really are, if you don't turn your camera on, you're losing value, you're using influence that you can't have on the person that, you know, you can sort of share by people showing your face and everything. So while maybe not making it mandatory, I think that people do miss to put all their chances on their side in order to send a message that they would like to send. So I think in that sense, it's just for everyone's best interest to have their camera on. And in terms of sort of day-to-day use of video teleconferencing, you know, I interviewed a little while ago an image coach for an article who was pretty much telling me, you know, crafting an image on video is just pretty much like crafting an image on real life. So it's just, you really have to think about what kind of message you want to send. And, you know, there are really different ways you can, you know, use your camera, use, you know, the way you look and everything to share the message. And it's just about thinking, you know, how you want people to perceive you and try to sort of use it on camera. And that applies as well to, I think, politicians and diplomats.
Building up on this, I wrote down how to prepare and the visual. I think how to prepare depends on your aim for the meeting. So regardless of that, there is one thing which applies to anything you need to prepare. Always get prepared, which means testing the light, testing the audio, testing the connection, and having a plan B always for everything. And sometimes, again, less might be more. So you can decide, going on practical tips for managing light. You might decide, particularly if you have a meeting which lasts a couple of hours or more, or a time when actually the light is changing, which is pretty much all the time. You might decide to actually close the window, and have artificial light. In this way, you can actually manage the light and control the light the way you want. Following up on this, and I'm very aware of the time, I discuss still images. I work with my case studies on still images, whereas all contribution were videos. So we are losing the cinematic quality of communication, which makes a huge and massive difference. And the post-production of communication. Again, we saw people using different kind of multimedia contribution into their own talk and speech. All these elements are part of the crafting the image that Stephanie was referring to. I would only close with reference to that, to the point that I think it's much more a commitment to craft a digital image than a real live image, because in real life you can actually engage and you have an immediate feedback, and there are times when you actually switch off your communication, whereas the digital image needs, in order to be successful and effective, needs to be portrayed over and over, and it takes one small element to destroy years of commitment. So in a way, I would reverse what the image coach has just argued with Stephanie and say that actually it takes much more effort and much more dedication to build up a digital image than a real one, a real life one. Over to Katharina.
Thank you. That was brilliant. I've been taking some notes, but there's also some things I want to follow up on, and I'm sure it's the same with our audience. Unfortunately, our time is up, so all that's left for me to do is provide some closing remarks. The first and most important thing in this regard is to thank our speakers, Stéphanie and Massimiliano, for sharing their experience and for really sparking this debate and kind of triggering all of us to pay a bit more attention to the questions of how we come across visually and how we use video and how this can be used as part of digital diplomacy. Let me also close with a couple of announcements. As always, you will receive the recording of this debate and a written summary as a follow-up. Then next month, we won't meet for a usual web debate, but we will have a conference on digital foreign policy on the 2nd of March, so exactly in 4 weeks. You can stay informed on that by, for example, subscribing to our newsletter on diplomacy.edu. Keep that in mind. It would be great to see many of you there as well when we dive into the policy aspects of digital diplomacy. Last but not least, there are a couple of resources that we've just posted in the chat. We will also then mention them again in the follow-up. For now, let me thank you for your excellent participation. It's been an absolute pleasure to be back with the web debates this year. And again, thank you to Stéphanie and Massimiliano for really providing this succinct guide and really interesting overview on the visual aspects of digital diplomacy and visual storytelling. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie. Thanks, Katharina. Thanks to everyone who contributed to today's very interesting web debate. I've continued seeing the many contributions. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. And also just to mention for our speakers, we received many, many positive comments in the chat of appreciation of all the details we touched upon today. So thank you so much.